So, as our viewers all know, growing numbers of Iranians are longing for a transition to democracy. At a minimum, I think we can assume people want to elect those that will govern them through transparent, fair, and inclusive processes. They want reasonable freedoms of belief, speech, and association. They want due process before the law. These are legitimate aspirations of all people. But those who care about the future of Iran would do well to think beyond merely emulating Western models of partisan democracy today, most of which are plagued with dysfunction and corruption. And we've heard already many people allude to these challenges. These models are often presented as the only alternative to tyranny, based on this assumption that these are the only alternatives to tyranny. The problems inherent in these models are widely accepted as necessary evils. But I want to argue many of them are not necessary, and Iranians need to take stock of these problems carefully as they aspire toward democracy. Western democracies are based on the premise that good governance requires individuals and groups to continuously compete for power. And the most common form of this, of course, is the party system. But party systems have clear tendencies toward gridlock, incivility, corruption, influence peddling, disregard for truth, and many other problems that have already been alluded to by others. These tendencies are inevitable outcomes of the model's underlying assumptions about human nature and social order. The first of these assumptions is that human nature is essentially, incorrigibly selfish and competitive. The second is that people should therefore organize themselves into competing groups to pursue their narrow self-interests. And the third assumption is that these contests for power can somehow magically be harnessed for the greater good through an invisible hand like that which supposedly operates in the free market. Based on these assumptions, democracy actually becomes a marketplace within which political entrepreneurs compete for power. Parties incorporate to pool the political capital of interest groups, and as a result, winning elections and extending political careers trump all other values. The most obvious problem with this model is the corrupting influence of money, because political competition is expensive. Successful campaigns are waged by those who have the financial support of affluent market actors. And this inverts the proper relationship between governments and markets. Rather than governments regulating markets in responsible ways, governments are captured by market actors. Partisan contests also undermine efforts to solve complex social and environmental problems because those contests reduce the diversity of perspectives that inform decision-making. And partisan contests also undermine long-term planning and cross-border collaboration and coordination, as we see so clearly today with issues like global warming and global health pandemics. So we have to begin thinking beyond inherited Western models of democracy. It's an existential imperative, not just for Iran, but for humanity as a whole. And moving beyond these inherited models will require sustained commitment to social learning and capacity building. There's no simple formula that can be identified today that offers all the answers, but underlying principles can be gleaned from a range of political innovations that help us see beyond today's dominant models. If these principles are applied by Iranians in processes of collective learning, they'll enable Iran to develop more mature approaches to democratic governance. So for instance, in the past few decades, many innovative experiments with deliberative democracy have been run in many different countries. These experiments have generated rich insights regarding how to engage diverse publics in thoughtful processes of consultation on complex issues in ways that foster mature views that can inform governmental decision-making. Other insights can be gleaned from nonpartisan democracies, which demonstrate how the divisive impacts of factionalization can be reduced. Now, nonpartisan democracies are distinct from one-party systems in which a single ideologically defined party constitutes the permanent state-sanctioned ruling party which controls who can stand for office. Truly nonpartisan democracies are open to candidates that reflect the full range of views present in a population. And a number of states and territories around the world have experience with this from which others can learn. Finally, I think a particularly interesting example in the context of this forum, the worldwide Baha'i community, which has its origins in Iran, has developed a very unique system of governance, of democratic governance, from which insights can also be gleaned. Baha'is have developed an electoral process that is entirely free of competition and gives voters true freedom of choice. Worldwide, Baha'is have constructed a system of these democratically elected assemblies that govern the community's affairs in over 6,000 localities and over 190 nations. In many parts of the world, the first exercise in democracy has occurred within Baha'i communities through a model that has its origins in Iran. Now, none of the examples I've just cited constitute a formulaic prescription for Iran. My purpose has been to highlight underlying principles that might inform processes of social learning and capacity building. Any transition of this kind will also need to take into account Iran's distinguished history, culture, and strengths to build on those. But I urge you to consider that with effort, Iranians can construct a more just and enlightened system of democratic governance that could serve as a model from which even long-established Western democracies might learn. And the time to lay the groundwork for this is now. This is the time for Iranians to carefully examine prevailing models of democracy, identify the most forward-looking innovations, and begin articulating an Iranian framework for democracy that moves beyond many of the limitations and corruptions of existing models. Because when the conditions for a transition arise, the path Iran will take will depend in part on who is offered or can offer a compelling vision for democracy.